Awesome. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. We've got a good sized crew, and we will, of course, record this and provide it out afterwards. So without any further ado, let's dive in. Awesome. So really excited to share some insights today around how teams can unify workflows across design and development in order to really make their design system practice more sustainable. I'm your host today, Andrew Rohman. I lead Knapsack customer success. I've spent really my whole career in and around digital production. And I'm going to share some insights and best practices for unifying teams. And then I'll be joined by Mike Bowser, who I first met when he was at Associated Press, and he's now leading the design system effort at Vista. Mike will share some of his experience in the space and some of the opportunities that he sees here. In our last webinar a couple weeks back, I just realized I may not be sharing some screens. So let's, good start. Catch our Twitter handles in case you want to follow up with any questions here. We'll go ahead and share this at the end as well. Awesome. So let's get into some best practices. In our last webinar a couple weeks back, we talked about the importance of behaviors to reaching our goals with systems and the opportunity to get to value quickly by adopting those behaviors today, really regardless of how mature or ready the system is. These behaviors, at their most simple, were about enabling teams to browse existing solutions and contribute their own solutions for others to browse as they build product experiences. If we do this at an organizational level, we really unlock that efficiency and consistency and sharing of innovation that we so often seek here with system-based digital production. And from a business standpoint, we see that taking this approach really helps teams see ROI more quickly and avoid some of the classic cultural challenges that come from operating for too long behind closed doors or in silos, as opposed to really engaging the full product team right out of the gate. But we also touched on these great divides, so to speak, that I'm sure everyone on this call has experienced. There's tension and conflicts that arise between the team managing the system and the teams using it to build product. And the system that the design team uses and references and maintains is often wholly separate from the system that engineering teams actually use to build products that customers touch, maybe save for some iframe embeds. So today we really want to dig into these challenges and talk a little bit about how we might be able to mitigate them. So let's look at how systems are often managed, distributed, and used by cross-functional teams working on a product or project or feature. There's likely unity in managing the system, right? There's a cross-functional team putting out all the pieces for all the teams, but more often than not, the enablement actually happens in different places with different tools across different functions. And so there might be some light connections within there, like embedding Storybook in your design documentation, but the primary tools really still aren't being shared by teams. Right? Designers and developers, much less other developers working in different technologies on different products, often have their own single sources of truth. These systems are then, of course, used by those disciplines in their phases of the project, but more often than not, there's other common solutions that they need that the system doesn't provide. And so those end up getting managed individually or maintained individually by designers and engineers working on that product. And so now we've got disconnected versions of systems. We've got subsystems that are cut off from other products and other teams, even though they were created because of limitations that those other teams are probably also hitting, right? So this is really not sustainable. And when we look at it at an organizational level, things start to get really chaotic. What seems like a single system managed by a single team turns out in reality to be a whole fractured ecosystem of Lego pieces all over the place, right? You give it a few years and this gets really, really out of control. So it's really no wonder that almost 50% of teams surveyed in the most recent Sparkbox design system survey say they're thinking about starting over. It's crazy. It's gross. What do we do? What do we do to avoid this? So it's really, really enticing to think about automation as the solution to this problem, right? Just make everything sync up and we won't have disconnects, right? Just use the robots, they'll do it. Well, the opportunity around automation is exciting, and there's some places where this is starting to be possible. There are, of course, teams that have invested heavily in building proprietary solutions to automate parts of their workflow with decent success. But overall, from our perspective, you really just can't rely on automation to solve the problems right out of the gate. right? We can't automate away human challenges that come with cross-functional collaboration until we've done the job of successfully aligning our teams, right? So first we align the humans through connectivity, transparency, and creating shared workspaces. Then where possible, we can start to automate with confidence because we've proven out that it works. Now, this idea of creating alignment by unifying touch points and workflows between design and dev is not a new concept, but it's something that we've traditionally done only in this area of natural overlap, right? Design dev handoff or project management, the areas where we're already sort of overlapping and intersecting. The individual execution within those functions is all too often still happening in silos, right? Invisible to the other teams entirely. And so with this approach, we're pretty much doomed to just keep living through the classic problems that, again, we've all experienced here that just stem from that miscommunication, right? They're often human challenges. So let's consider this alternative, right? The unification at the system level is actually reflected in how teams are enabled. It's a central source of truth through which all of the different single sources can be accessed and viewed. And around this point, we can start to build shared workflows across the teams. And by opening up not just consumption, but contribution and collaboration pathways to both designers and engineers across those product teams, we stop seeing that need for the individual libraries or subsystems, right? We stop having that extra point of fracture. The whole organization actually starts to work better and stay in sync. And really important, the system actually keeps improving as opposed to just sort of continuing to create more and more of those fractured endpoints. And at the organizational level, this is where that flywheel really starts turning. Solutions and improvements from one team are seen by others hitting all those same limitations. And what goes from points of fracture and disconnect become really an opportunity for evolution and improvement of the system. And so, simply this is really the difference between teams using design systems or using a design system across functions and actually starting to think about how we operate systematically as an entire organization, right? As a product team, right? There's a difference there. I'm not just using a piece. This is really about fundamentally how we work. So with that, I'm going to welcome to the virtual stage here, Mr. Mike Bowser from Vista. Mike's someone that we've learned a lot from as we've seen how he has approached some of these challenges as a leader. So I'll stop the presentation and, Mike, maybe you can just introduce yourself, share a little bit about your role and experience.
I just realized I was muted.
You caught yourself though, that's what counts.
I did. Andrew, you told me to wear a Boston hat, so I hope that this is okay. Literal Boston hat, do my best. Happy to be here, great to meet everyone. My name is Mike Bowser. I'm a design director at Vista. I was previously a global creative director at the Associated Press and have been working with design systems for a few years now. I also teach a design systems course at Parsons School of Design. And that was a great experience, just going deep in research and really kind of looking at a lot of different organizations and how they were solving some of the shared challenges that we all have as users and participants in the system space. Just a quick point on Vista. Vista comes from a transformation that Vistaprint is going through. So Vistaprint seeks to help small businesses elevate what is remarkable about them, and we're increasingly doing that in the digital space, in addition to the print customization that we're known for.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about sort of your experience trying to solve for this, right? As you bring designers and engineers closer together, what are the challenges you run into?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when I think about this challenge, it's kind of hard for me to talk about that without bringing up Knapsack, because Knapsack for us has been a tool to help greatly with that challenge, both at the AP and now at Vista. But I think more importantly, I'll touch on the theme that you brought up, which is visibility. I think for me, it's really creating like this shared sense of space. Like the challenge at Vista is a little bit unique in that it's such a big organization. So we're going through massive change on the identity system side, the brand side, a different product org side, changes in engineering structure. And so creating a shared sense of space to come and see what is happening. What does it look like to prototype? What does it look like to kind of work with what we already have in our system? And so having that visibility, I think, is key for creating that tighter alignment.
And what do you see as, I guess, kind of the opportunity there? Like what changes once you start to actually create that sort of shared workspace and alignment?
Sure. I mean, a lot. I think for me, I mean, I'm a designer, but I consider the code to be the source of truth because that's what's actually expressed in the product UI. That's what our users and customers are going to be working with. And so there are many benefits to have a tighter alignment there. I think that, just to touch on a few, engineers are great problem solvers. And so if, as a designer and design team, you do a good job building that relationship, you're going to get a lot of great feedback on your process. But also it starts to kind of help get into some of the deeper considerations around design systems. I mean, a usable system is you've articulated a point of view on what the visual design language is and probably what the interaction model is. But there is a lot more to think about. I think if you start to work with developers in a shared tool that we can start to kind of prototype and see what's happening with the actual code, you start to then have conversations around some of the deeper considerations. Are these dynamic elements? Do we want to give users in the content authoring tool control over these specific things? Do we not want to give them control over those things? What are the considerations around building out the tooling that has to enable some of the different design patterns or components that we're bringing into the system? So for me, anything that helps create the space to have those conversations is a big plus. And I think also, you know, and you mentioned this in your opening presentation, but you know, contributions. I think that the more we can create a space to have the work that's probably already happening in many cases in the organization come in and be visible to other teams. I mentioned this a little bit, but part of I was describing the unique challenge of Vista. We have multi-platform, multi-product, and we have other design systems out there. And so it's not going to be kind of an overnight thing to bring these all together. But as we do start to bring them together, having that visibility is key for other teams that I'm not actually working with as closely yet.
How do you see this potentially benefiting, you know, beyond design and development? Is there opportunity there for kind of the larger organization involved in production?
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I'm just, you know, curious how, you know, we talk a lot about getting design and development together. I'm curious, you know, as you talk about sort of operating at a little bit of a higher level, you know, are there ways that you've seen, you know, being able to involve product managers or, you know, content editors or others beyond just purely design and development in the system workflows?
I kind of thought that's where you're going with that. Sure. So I've been at Vista 7 months, and I'm, you know, building out a team and kind of putting some of these processes in place. So a couple of things. One is, one of the lessons I learned, which I think is helpful to share out, is that I have previously built teams that have been like super responsive, and that's a good thing, and you need to be. So you need to be, you know, helping out adjacent teams as quickly as you can. But I think it's worth taking the time to put the process and methodologies in place that will help you scale. And even if that means saying no to some things, carve out the time to do that. I think some of the benefits of working this way is that you get better alignment with product teams, with the brand and marketing creative teams, and they start to see, you know, one of the things that's interesting, like I said, with the transition here at Vista, there's a lot that happens in theoretical and conceptual conversations, but systems kind of make it real. And so if you do get, you know, in early enough to start building things that people can use, it helps create, you know, build relationships with those cross-functional teams. That's ultimately going to help you scale.
What I love hearing you talk about kind of how you've, you know, what you've prioritized and sort of where you focused your efforts. What do you see as, like, when do you start to see impact, right? Is it by establishing those processes? Is it once we've built out and established tooling? You know, when do you start to see that impact?
You know, for me, it's we we decided with, as we started to work with Knapsack, because that was going to be the place where we were going to have these conversations happen, that we would kind of go use case by use case. And so for me, the benefits happened immediately. Like when I am able to spin up a prototype and get feedback from others, when I'm able to bring in some of the conversations that are happening. I mean, a good example is, we have merch tech teams that are using many different patterns throughout product detail pages, category pages. And in a controlled environment like Figma, which is a great tool and we use it and I love it, it's a little bit easier to have the design appear as you want it. And when you start working with true representational data and you get into localized content, you get into weird aspect ratios with images, it's much easier to have that conversation with our stakeholders and take a look and say, here are some of the trade-offs that we need to talk about. How do we make these adjustments and then submit that? So for me, the working in this way pays off immediately, because those questions and support requests don't ever stop. They keep coming in, and we want to be a good partner on the system side. So
yeah, I love that. That really, I think, underscores this is more about how you work, and you can get benefit from that pretty quickly than it is about the long march to build the MVP and release the system in whatever scope it is. Yeah, I think that's awesome. That echoes some of the things that our panelists last webinar shared as well around trying that approach of build the whole thing and roll it out. There's so many problems to it, but if we can just enable teams to kind of work in this way organically in what they're already doing, we start to see that benefit right away. Do you see is there an impact in kind of resourcing or how you think about structuring kind of the system team based on this way of working?
There is, yeah, and I might be atypical in how I'm thinking about structuring our team. It's great to have systems experience. I think it's also important to look for contributors that can go deep in some other areas. So, people that care a lot about beautiful visual design, a deep understanding of product ownership and management. One thing that I had in my notes that I think is super important is get a UX engineer on your team. Like that should be the thing that you really fight for when you're, having those conversations about budgeting and hiring. That's going to help you in many ways, but also to build strength and relationships. And I think that also looking at alignment with contributors from throughout the organization. If you have folks that have a systems thinking mindset and are interested in what you're doing, create the space for them to contribute. I mean, that gets a little bit into like advocacy and community and your efforts to build that, but it's critical and it's a lot of fun because you get an outside perspective on what you're doing. So.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's, you're talking about the human element, right? We got to get people connected and working. We got to, have empathy for the folks that are using this and are supporting it. It, really underscores, I think, what we're saying here, and that it goes well beyond just having the Lego pieces and the guides and using them effectively, but actually changing the way an organization works together to churn out product experiences, right? Makes a ton of sense.
Specifically on the resourcing part, I mean, I think, again, going back to that theme of visibility, where you have, pockets throughout your organization, I mean, depending, like a smaller startup might not be the case, but certainly in medium or larger orgs, you're probably going to have some redundancy in some of the experimental work that's happening. And so when you create that shared sense of space to come together, you get visibility into that and say, hey, we're actually working on a similar thing. And it's kind of funny because thinking about this as you were speaking earlier, there are a lot of parallels, I think, to how we work in systems with the challenge that we've all had in remote first working, which is how do we, figure out how to work best in async. I have a habit because I meet with a lot of people to kind of think, oh, we'll just set up a meeting, and that's not the best use of everyone's time. But thinking about ways to do that and say, here's the place to go where we're actually doing this experimental or innovative work and seeing what other engineer and designer pairs might be doing throughout the organization.
Yeah, we've seen so much benefit come from just enabling, as you said, the visibility and the sort of discoverability of, there's a lot of great design and engineering work happening even outside of what's in the system, and people are running into and solving experience challenges. And the more we can do to make that discoverable and shareable, even if all it does is spark a conversation between two otherwise disconnected teams about what might be the best solution, like that's going to get us infinitely more value than having a really solid button or checkout flow that I can import, so I love it. There's at least one question I want to get into here, but before we transition, any shameless plugs for open roles at Vista or anything like that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we're building out a pretty significant UX or experience design org. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me. A lot happening on the UX side. If anyone is interested in design ops, anything like that, we've got a bunch open. So awesome.
Mike is humble, but he is awesome. And I have every belief that he's a wonderful person to work with from our time working together. Check out, I think it's careers.vista.com. Is that right?
Just go to vista.com. Yeah, I think that might be the subdomain, but yeah, if you go to vista.com, which is not much right now. It's just a page with some pointer links, but that's what we're building out. And at the same time, continuing to enhance Vista Print, which is a great business.
Oh, I just sent me. Awesome. Definitely check that out. Mike's Twitter handle is @MikeBowser as well. I want to open it up to a question that actually I'm going to ask you to answer first, Mike. Matt in the audience asks, how do you manage governance with larger organizations like yours and still enable smaller teams to feel confident in contributing? I know you've not only got Vista, you've got teams that have come in through acquisition. So I'm sure it's an interesting landscape. How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. Again, I think that the Vista design system is a little atypical in that it was an engineering-led pursuit, with design partnership. So we have a fully realized coded component library that, and many engineering teams that understand the value. So, governance in that respect kind of happened organically. What we're working to kind of catch up on or playing catch up on is the design documentation and guidelines that would accompany that. And since we're going through this big transition on the brand identity system side, now feels like the right time to do that. So I'm kind of starting to think about how we're going to work with governance philosophically. I'm more inclined to kind of model out what we think good design and application behavior is, and then allow teams to have that flexibility, but then be, hyper consistent where we don't want that flexibility. So when it comes to naming conventions and, how we're actually implementing the system, we want to be consistent, but leaving enough flexibility for teams to be able to design in a way that's best for their particular scenarios.
Makes a ton of sense.
I hope I answered that question.
I think, well, I'll let Matt say, who's in the audience. I have some other questions, but any other questions from the audience here? Oh, great. Tommy popping in. What kind of visibility have you found to be the most impactful to other teams in the org? Is it what you share that gets folks excited and confident in what you're building with design systems? Is it an Knapsack site? Is it an experience you could point to and say what came from the system? How do you get others engaged?
It's a little bit of a mix. Yeah. I mean, certainly having Knapsack is a huge plus because we actually have a place to go and we can, do the kind of configuration, experimentation, things like that. It's sharing out. So making sure that we're able to participate in regular meetings where we share out what's happening with the team. And then also, and this is something I did at the AP that I've started to do at Vista, but need to put a little bit more work in, is the idea of like an open studio where having dedicated time for anyone to come in and raise issues or concerns and or just chat with us about ideas they have. I think having that dedicated time and making sure that everyone in the organization that should know about it does know about it makes it a little bit easier versus somebody kind of knocking on your door and saying, hey, I have this idea. They know there's a forum for that, and so that's been helpful as well.
Yeah, we talk a lot about kind of making it easy to do the right thing and again focusing on the human element, and I hear a lot of that in how you work, right? Enabling people to have the flexibility they need, so it's not just this is how you must design and build, making sure there's that forum for the sort of feedback and input back in from the people that are your users and customers, right? In terms of the product team members. I'm curious, the last question on my end, do you see an increased burden here, right? Because the flip side of not having teams building out their own separate subsystems is there's now more feedback and more edge cases that they may be expecting the system team to handle. So how do you think about, planning for that? Is it continuing to enable teams to do their own thing while you synthesize and work in, or is it beefing up the system team? What's that mean?
It's kind of a little bit of both. I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to subsystems. I think it's doing a better job of coordinating and communicating. So if there is a need for a part of what is for us a pretty broad digital product ecosystem, if there's a need for a team to have a specific set of components or patterns, I think that that's fine. I think that it needs to feel cohesive in that it's tied into what we would call our core system or connected in a meaningful way. But we want to be able to, again, kind of have visibility into what is happening there, and then figure out a time that we might bring that into the core system so that it then, benefits other teams that might have a need for it. So I think it's really those two things, like coordination and communication. If we do that well, then having a core system that connects in a meaningful way to some of these other subsystems is fine.
Yeah. Again, very human themes of visibility and connectivity and alignment. So I love it. Awesome. I know we're running up against time here. Any other questions before we wrap up? And of course, we do have some additional ways you can contact Knapsack. Again, Twitter handles Mike Bowser and at Andrew_Rohman. And we'll go ahead and you all get a recording of this as well. But any last questions here before we wrap up our webinar? Someone furiously typing. I like it. How can a design team define the first steps, needs, and requirements before jumping into such a tool? And if you have to hop mic, I can finish answering this.
You know what? I guess I would just say to that, create a prioritization matrix tied to some of the audit work that you've done throughout the experience. Figure out what's approachable, what you might be able to do, and then just start with that one component at a time or one pattern at a time. Here's the thing we think is going to add value to the organization, and prioritize that. And once you start to socialize that, you'll probably get momentum, and then you can kind of go from there. Yeah, I echo that and say, we obviously mentioned Knapsack here. There are other ways to achieve this unification. Certainly, teams have spent, built custom solutions for this. But I think it's really not ultimately about the tooling so much as you said, this alignment, right? Can we get designers and engineers, even just working on the product or feature you're working on, right? Even outside of a big design system context, how can we start to look at, hey, are there things here that we can capture somehow and make available for others to see and reuse? That's what Tommy, who asked the question here and was on our last webinar, mentioned. And it starts snowballing. And next thing you know, you've created a culture of reuse and collaboration without having the big, scary design system cliff that you got to get past first. So awesome. Mike, I know you've got another commitment. This has been great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, we'll follow up with the recording, and always look forward to hearing from any of you through our email or social channels. So thanks for showing up today. Yeah, hey, thanks so much for having me on. I had a blast. It was really fun. Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Team Knapsack.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.